How speaking less makes your words more valuable and powerful instantly. There's a power most men give away without realizing it every day, in every conversation, without even noticing the leak. It's not money, not time, not even attention, though it touches all three. It's their words. Most men talk too much, not because they have something to say, but because silence makes them uncomfortable, because they mistake volume for value, explanation for intelligence, because somewhere along the way they learned that filling space means mattering. But here's what the strongest men know, what the Stoics practiced in rooms full of noise. The less you speak, the more weight your words carry. Silence isn't empty, it's loaded. It's observing while others perform. It's choosing precision over noise. It's letting your presence say what your mouth doesn't need to, and when you finally do speak, people lean in because scarcity creates value in markets, in life, in conversation. If you're ready to reclaim the power you've been scattering through unnecessary words, if you're tired of explaining yourself to people who weren't really listening anyway, then stay, because what we're about to explore will change how you show up in every room you enter. Consider subscribing for the part of you that's done performing and ready to command. Context: the problem with verbal incontinence. 0:45 to 3:30. Walk into any room and you'll see it immediately. The ones who talk the most, commanding the least respect constantly, explaining, constantly justifying, constantly seeking validation through sound. They mistake participation for contribution. They confuse being heard with being understood, and they wonder why their words bounce off walls, why nothing they say seems to land with force, because they've inflated their currency. When you speak about everything, you speak powerfully about nothing. Your words become wallpaper, present but invisible, easy to tune out. Think about the last conversation where someone wouldn't stop talking, where they circled the same point 5 different ways, where they answered questions you didn't ask, where they filled every pause. Like silence was an emergency. What did you feel? Probably not respect, probably something closer to exhaustion, maybe pity. That's what happens when words lose their scarcity. They lose their value. The Stoics understood this in a world that valued oratory and public speaking. Epictetus said, "We have 2 ears and 1 mouth, so that we can listen twice as much as we speak." Not because speaking is bad, but because most speaking is waste. It's reflex, it's nervousness, it's the ego trying to prove it exists. And in proving it exists, it reveals its weakness, because the man who needs constant verbal validation is the man who doubts his own substance. He talks to fill the gaps in his confidence. He explains because he doesn't trust his actions to speak. He defends because he's not sure there's anything worth defending. But the disciplined man, he's different. He knows that every word is a choice, that every sentence spent is energy he won't get back. He treats his speech like ammunition, finite, valuable, and only deployed when it counts. This isn't about being antisocial or mysterious for the sake of performance. It's about understanding a fundamental truth. Power concentrates where waste decreases. When you cut the excess, what remains becomes essential. When you eliminate the meaningless, the meaningful becomes magnetic. Law 1. Silence as strategic observation. Most people enter a room and immediately start broadcasting. They share opinions, tell stories, fill space, thinking this is how you establish presence. But real presence doesn't announce itself. It settles. The first law of verbal power is simple. Observe before you engage while others are performing. You're studying while they're reacting. You're calculating while they're talking themselves into corners. You're learning exactly who they are, because people reveal themselves in unguarded moments. And the fastest way to make someone unguarded is to give them a silent audience. Silence creates discomfort, and in that discomfort, masks slip. People overshare, they overexplain, they show you their insecurities, gift wrapped in words. And you just listen, not passively, actively, with focus, with intent. You notice patterns in what they say and what they avoid. You catch the contradictions, the hesitations, the topics they circle around but never land on you. Read the room while everyone else is trying to write themselves into it. This is strategic intelligence gathering disguised as simple courtesy. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The first rule is to keep an untroubled spirit." And nothing troubles your spirit faster than entering every conversation with your mouth running. When you observe first, you act from information, not assumption. You speak from clarity, not compulsion. You contribute value because you actually understand what's needed, not just what you want to say. Here's what happens when you make silence your opening position. People start projecting onto you. They assume depth because they can't see the bottom. They assume competence because you're not scrambling to prove it. They assume authority because you're not begging for it through verbal gymnastics. And while they're making these assumptions, you're gathering actual intelligence. You're learning who to trust and who to avoid, who speaks from experience and who speaks from ego, who adds value and who extracts it through attention-seeking behavior. This doesn't mean you become a mute statue. It means your first instinct isn't to fill every gap in conversation. It means you're comfortable in the pause, in the space between statements, because that space is where thinking happens, where insight forms, and when you finally speak from that space, it lands differently. People feel the weight because it's not coming from nervousness or need, it's coming from deliberate choice. And they sense the difference. They might not be able to name it, but they feel it in their bodies. The man who speaks only when he has something to say commands more attention than the man who says something just to be speaking. That's not theory. That's observable reality in every boardroom, every social gathering, every moment where influence is being negotiated. Law 2. The economy of words. Words are currency. And just like money, the more you print, the less each unit is worth. The second law is understanding that verbal restraint creates verbal value. Think of someone you respect, someone whose opinion actually matters to you. Chances are they don't talk constantly when they speak. You listen because their words are rare enough to be valuable. They've created an economy where their input is scarce and therefore precious. Now think of someone who never stops talking, someone who has an opinion on everything, a story for every moment, a need to contribute, even when they have nothing to contribute. Their words are inflated currency, abundant and worthless. You can ignore 10 sentences from them without missing anything important because they've trained you to expect noise, not signal. Here's the shift. Start treating your words like limited resources, not because you're rationing for scarcity's sake, but because you recognize that quality and quantity are inversely related in conversation. Seneca wrote, "Everywhere means nowhere." The man who speaks to every topic with equal enthusiasm speaks powerfully to none. When you focus your verbal energy, you multiply its impact. This means getting comfortable with "I don't know" and "I haven't thought enough about that to have an opinion." This means letting conversations happen around you without feeling obligated to insert yourself. This means recognizing that most discussions don't need your input. They need your attention, maybe, but not your words. The disciplined man asks himself before speaking, does this add value or does it add noise? If it's noise, he holds it. If it's value, he delivers it with precision. No preamble, no apology, no need to soften it with unnecessary words. Watch what happens when you shift from quantity to quality. Your words start carrying authority because they're not diluted by filler people. Stop interrupting you because they've learned that what you say is worth hearing. Completely silence follows your statements instead of competing voices because you've left space for your words to land. You're no longer in verbal competition, you're above it, because competition happens among equals, frantically fighting for the same level of attention. But when you speak rarely and speak well, you're not competing. You're operating from a different frequency entirely. Think of it like this. A man who hands out business cards to everyone he meets cheapens his network, but a man who only exchanges cards with people who matter builds a valuable network. Same principle with words, scatter them everywhere, and they mean nothing. Place them carefully, and they become tools of influence. This doesn't mean you become cryptic or play games with information. It means you respect language enough to use it precisely. One clear sentence beats 5 wandering ones. One honest no beats 10 apologetic explanations. One direct question beats a paragraph of assumptions. The economy of words isn't about being minimal for aesthetics. It's about maximizing impact through elimination of waste. And the man who masters this begins to sound different than everyone else. Not because he's using bigger words or more complex ideas, but because every word he does use has been filtered through the question, is this necessary? And when everything unnecessary has been stripped away, what's left is pure signal, and pure signal. That's what moves people, changes minds, creates respect. Law 3. Silence as power retention. Every time you speak, you reveal something: your position, your thoughts, your emotional state, your vulnerabilities, and in most situations, especially ones involving negotiation or conflict, revelation is disadvantage. The third law, silence, is how you hold your power when everyone else is spending theirs. Watch an amateur in a negotiation. They talk to fill discomfort. They explain their reasoning, justify their position, offer information that wasn't requested. They think they're being transparent or building rapport, but what they're actually doing is handing over leverage, because the more you say, the more material you give the other person to work with. They learn your pressure points, your concerns, your limits, and skilled operators will use every word you didn't need to say against you. Now, watch a master. They state their position once, clearly, then stop. They don't elaborate unless directly asked. They don't fill the silence that follows. With nervous energy, they sit in it, comfortable, unmoved by the discomfort radiating from the other person and that silence. It does the work. It creates pressure on the other person to speak, to fill the void, to offer concessions, because most people can't tolerate the weight of quiet. They interpret it as judgment, as disagreement, as something that needs fixing, and in trying to fix it, they reveal their hand. Epictetus taught that the chief task in life is simply this: to identify what's in your control and what isn't. Your words are in your control. Fully their interpretation, their reception, their effect, not fully in your control. So the strategic move is to control what you can, the release of information through speech, and to observe what you can't. How others respond when you refuse to fill every silence. This creates a gravitational pull. People become curious, uncertain, off balance. They start talking more to compensate for your talking less, and in talking more, they expose more. You start seeing people's true intentions, not through what they say directly, but through what they reveal when they're uncomfortable with your silence. This is why silence is power retention. You're not giving away your position, your strategy, your emotional state. You're holding it close, revealing only what serves your purpose and everyone else. They're bleeding information, thinking it's connection. Here's what this looks like practically. Someone asks your opinion on a controversial topic. Amateur response. Launches into a full explanation, defends the position, addresses counter-arguments no one raised. Disciplined response. I'm still forming my view on that, or I don't think I need to weigh in on that. Boom. Power retained, no vulnerability created, no ammunition handed over. Someone tries to provoke you with an insult or passive aggression. Amateur response. Defends immediately, explains why they're wrong, engages the provocation. Disciplined response. Silence. Or a simple okay with no emotional charge. Boom. You've refused to play, refused to react, refused to give them the response they were fishing for. Someone asks what you're working on, what your plans are, what you're trying to build. Amateur response. Spills everything, seeks validation, hopes for encouragement. Disciplined response. A few things I'm not ready to talk about yet. Boom. Mystery maintained, expectations unset, pressure to perform removed. This isn't about being secretive or withholding. It's about recognizing that strategic silence is how you maintain optionality. Once you've spoken, you're locked in. Once you've revealed, you can't unreveal. But when you hold back, you maintain flexibility. You can respond to what actually unfolds, rather than what you prematurely committed to through premature speech. The men who move through high-stakes situations with calm authority, the ones who seem unrattled by chaos, unmoved by pressure, they're not superhuman. They've just trained themselves not to leak power through unnecessary words. They've learned that in the space between being asked and answering, there's a choice, and that choice, to speak or to hold, is where control lives. Most people never find that space because they react automatically. The question comes, the mouth opens, words flow without conscious decision. But the disciplined man has created a buffer stimulus, pause, conscious choice, response or silence. That buffer is everything. It's the difference between being controlled by conversation and controlling your participation in it. And when you're the one who controls that, you're no longer playing the game everyone else is playing. You're playing a different game entirely, one where silence is a move, not an absence. Law 4. The magnetic pull of restraint. There's something about the person who doesn't need to speak that makes everyone want to hear them. It's counterintuitive, but it's undeniable. The less available you make yourself verbally, the more people seek your input. The fourth law, restraint creates desire. Think about the person at a party or meeting who's holding court, talking loudly, telling story after story, dominating the conversation. Now think about the person in the corner who's been quiet the whole time, just observing, occasionally smiling. Which one do you want to talk to? If you're honest, probably the quiet one, because there's mystery there. There's depth you haven't accessed yet. The loud one has already shown you everything. There's nothing left to discover. This is basic psychology. Humans value what's scarce and undervalue what's abundant. When you make your words abundant, people scroll past them mentally. When you make them scarce, people lean in. They start asking your opinion specifically. They notice when you do speak because it's unusual. They remember what you said because it stood out against the silence. You become someone worth listening to, not because you said something brilliant, but because you don't waste their time with verbal filler. Carl Jung said, knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people. Part of that darkness is the ego's desperate need to be seen, heard, validated through constant performance. When you master that need, when you no longer require verbal validation, something shifts in how others perceive you. They sense that you're not performing for them, that you're comfortable in your own mind, that you don't need their approval. And ironically, that makes them approve of you more, because approval-seeking behavior repels while self-possession attracts. This creates a magnetic pull. People are drawn to what they don't fully understand, and the person who speaks sparingly is inherently harder to fully understand. There's depth there that hasn't been excavated through constant talking, and humans are naturally curious. We want to know what's beneath the surface, so we pay more attention to the person who hasn't revealed everything. We assign them intelligence, wisdom, significance, often more than they might even possess, because we fill the gaps with positive assumptions. That's the power of strategic verbal restraint. You let others project value onto you, and projection in your favor is better than anything you could claim about yourself, because people believe their own conclusions more than your advertisements. When you tell someone you're competent, they're skeptical. When they conclude you're competent because of how you carry yourself and choose your words, they're convinced you didn't have to sell it. They bought it on their own. Here's what restraint looks like in practice. In a group discussion, most people jump in the moment they have a thought. You wait. You let 3 or 4 people speak first. You listen to the patterns. You notice what's being missed. You wait for the actual opening. Then, When you speak, it's not just another voice added to the pile, it's a shift. People pause because you don't speak often, so this must matter. That's magnetic pull in action in one-on-one conversation. Most people talk about themselves constantly. You ask questions, real questions, not just setups for your own stories. You listen to the answers. You follow up with curiosity. You make the other person feel understood, and then, when they finally ask about you, you give them the abbreviated version. You don't dump your entire life story. You give them enough to be interesting, but not enough to be fully known. That's restraint. Creating desire to know more in conflict, most people escalate verbally, raising voices, multiplying words, repeating themselves. You lower your volume, you reduce your word count. You state your boundary once and then stop. You don't engage the emotional spiral. You just hold your line quietly. And that restraint in the face of chaos, it's magnetic because it's rare. It signals a level of self-control most people don't have. It makes you someone who can be trusted in high-pressure situations, because if you don't lose your composure in an argument, you probably won't lose it when real stakes are involved. The magnetic pull of restraint isn't manipulation. It's honest signaling. You're signaling through your behavior that you have an internal center, that you're not dependent on external validation, that you have resources, mental, emotional, intellectual, that you're not desperately trying to prove, and people are drawn to that because it's stable in a world of instability, noise, and constant performance anxiety. The person who's calm and contained becomes a reference point, becomes someone others want to be around, want to work with, want to learn from. Not because you're trying to be those things, but because you've stopped trying to be everything to everyone. Aristotle said, "We are what we repeatedly do." Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. The habit of verbal restraint, practiced daily in small moments, becomes excellence in communication over time. You don't need to be the loudest to be the most influential. You don't need to be the most talkative to be the most memorable. You just need to understand that in a world drowning in noise, clarity is magnetic, and clarity comes from saying less, but meaning more. Law 5. Silence as emotional sovereignty. The moment you realize most speech is just unprocessed emotion looking for a release valve, you can't unsee it. Someone cuts you off in traffic, immediate verbal response, usually aggressive. Someone criticizes your work, defensive explanation, justification, counterattack. Someone questions your decision. You feel compelled to explain every detail of your reasoning, all of it. Reaction, not response, all of it. Emotion that hasn't been metabolized. Demanding immediate expression, the fifth law. Silence is how you maintain emotional sovereignty. It's the space between trigger and reaction, where you decide whether this deserves your energy. Most men leak emotional control through their mouth. They speak from anger and reveal weakness. They speak from insecurity and create vulnerability. They speak from fear and invite more of what they're afraid of, because uncontrolled speech is confession. It tells everyone exactly what's disturbing your peace, exactly what has power over you. The Stoics were obsessed with this gap, the space between what happens and how you respond. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." That power starts with your mouth shut. When something triggers you, the disciplined response is silence, not permanent silence, but strategic pause, long enough for the emotional wave to crest and fall, long enough for your prefrontal cortex to come back online, long enough to ask, is this emotion useful, or is it just old programming running? Because most of what we feel intensely isn't about the present moment, it's about past wounds, childhood conditioning, unmet needs from years ago. And when you speak from that place, you're not addressing the situation in front of you. You're just spraying unprocessed emotion into the world and hoping it hits something that makes you feel better. It never does, but silence gives you sovereignty. It lets you choose your response based on who you want to be, not what you happen to be feeling. Here's what this looks like. Someone disrespects you. In a meeting, every cell in your body wants to clap back immediately, to reassert dominance, to not let it slide, but you breathe. You let the moment hang there without filling it with defensive energy. Maybe you address it, maybe you don't. But when you do, it's measured, deliberate, strategic. Not a reflex, not a reaction, a choice, and that choice, visible to everyone in the room, signals something important. You cannot be baited. You cannot be controlled. You are not a puppet of your emotions. That's power, or someone you care about says something that stings. The impulse is to hurt them back, to make them feel what you're feeling, but you hold it. You recognize that responding from pain only creates more pain. You give yourself time to process, to understand what the sting is actually about. And then, when you're ready, you speak, clearly, honestly, without the venom that would have come from the triggered state. That's not weakness. That's sovereignty. You're not controlled by your emotions. You're informed by them. There's a difference. The man who says every thought that crosses his mind is enslaved to his impulses. The man who filters his speech through awareness is free, and that freedom shows. It shows in how he doesn't escalate when others do it, shows in how he can sit with discomfort without needing to discharge it verbally. It shows in how his words, when they come, are considered, not perfect, but intentional. Seneca taught that we suffer more in imagination than in reality, and most verbal reactivity is exactly that. Imaginative suffering made real through speech. You imagine what someone meant. You imagine the threat. You imagine the disrespect. And before you've even confirmed any of it, you've responded as if it's all true. You've created the conflict through premature speech. But the sovereign man checks his story before he speaks it. He asks, do I know this is true, or am I reacting to my interpretation? And often, the answer is the latter, so he stays quiet, asks a question instead of making an accusation, gives space for clarity, and 9 times out of 10, the imagined threat dissolves. The problem was never what was said. It was the story he almost told himself, and then defended verbally. This is why silence is emotional sovereignty. It protects you from being hijacked by the immediate reaction. It gives you time to choose whether the emotion is signal or noise. And it prevents you from saying things that feel good in the moment, but cost you respect, relationships, and peace. In the long run, think about the last time you spoke in anger and regretted it, or the last time you overshared from insecurity and felt exposed afterward, or the last time you explained yourself to someone who didn't deserve the explanation and walked away feeling diminished. All of it could have been avoided with silence, not forever, just long enough to regain your center, because centered speech lands differently than scattered speech. It carries authority because it's not contaminated with unprocessed emotion. It creates respect because it shows you're not controlled by your feelings, and it builds trust because people know you won't say something in the heat of the moment that you'll have to take back later. Emotional sovereignty through silence doesn't mean you become cold or detached. It means you become responsible for your emotional expression. You feel everything, but you choose what gets released, when, and how. That's maturity, that's strength, and that's rare enough to be immediately noticeable in a world where most people are just verbally vomiting their unprocessed states onto whoever's nearby. Law 6. The authority of the unspoken. There's a quiet authority that has nothing to do with credentials or titles. It comes from the person who doesn't need to announce what they know, don't need to defend their position, don't need to fill every silence with proof of their value. The 6th law, what you don't say, often speaks louder than what you do, because the need to explain is a tell. It signals insecurity, uncertainty, a lack of faith in your own substance. The truly confident don't over-explain. They state, then stop. They trust that their presence, their track record, their actions are already speaking, and they're right. Think about leaders you respect. The ones with real authority, not the ones performing it. They tend to speak less than you'd expect. They make one clear statement and let it land. They don't dilute it with qualifiers, don't soften it with excessive context, don't repeat it 5 different ways, hoping one version sticks. They trust the weight of their words because they've built credibility through consistency, not volume. That's the authority of the unspoken, letting your reputation speak so your mouth doesn't have to when you constantly explain yourself. You undermine your own authority. You're essentially saying, I don't think you'll believe me unless I convince you, which makes people wonder if maybe you're not that believable. But when you state something with calm certainty and then stop, you're saying, this is true whether you agree or not. And that certainty, even if you're wrong, commands more respect than the most eloquent explanation delivered. With hesitation, Lao Tzu wrote, those who know do not speak. Those who speak do not know. That might be extreme, but the principle holds. Excessive speech often masks deficiency. The person who truly understands something can explain it simply and briefly. The person still grasping for understanding talks in circles, hoping quantity compensates for clarity. Here's what the authority of the unspoken looks like. You're in a meeting and someone challenges your idea. Amateur response launches into a 10-minute defense, addressing every possible objection, seeking approval from everyone in the room. Authoritative response. I understand your concern. I've considered that. I still think this is the right move. Done. You've acknowledged without conceding, you've shown confidence without arrogance, and you've saved everyone 10 minutes. You're asked why you made a certain decision in your personal life. Amateur response explains every factor, every consideration, every alternative you weighed, seeking validation. Authoritative response. It felt like the right choice for where I am. Done. You've given an answer without giving away your entire decision-making process. Boundaries matter. Even in conversation, someone tries to pull you into gossip about someone else. Amateur response engages, adds their own observations, participates in the degradation. Authoritative response. I don't really have anything to say about that. Done. You've declined without being preachy, without explaining why gossip is wrong, without making it a thing. The authority is in the restraint itself. This doesn't mean you never explain anything or never elaborate. It means you're selective. You give detail when it adds value, when it serves a purpose, when it helps someone understand something genuinely complex. But you don't explain to manage people's perception of you. You don't elaborate to fill awkward silence. You don't over-clarify because you're afraid of being misunderstood. Because here's the truth. People will misunderstand you no matter what you say. The amateur tries to prevent all misunderstanding through exhaustive explanation. The authority accepts that misunderstanding is inevitable and doesn't waste energy trying to control others' interpretations. Socrates said, strong minds discuss ideas. Average minds discuss events. Weak minds discuss people. And I'll add, silent minds let their actions discuss themselves. The most powerful communication often happens through what you do, not what you say about what you do. Your results speak. Your consistency speaks. Your character, demonstrated over time, speaks. And when those things are speaking clearly, your words become supplemental, not essential. That's when you've achieved the authority of the unspoken. You're no longer trying to convince people of your value. Your value is self-evident. You're no longer defending your decisions. Your decisions defend themselves through outcomes. You're no longer explaining your boundaries. People feel them through your consistent enforcement. And the less you need to say, the more weight each word carries when you choose to speak. This creates a virtuous cycle. Restraint builds authority. Authority justifies restraint. More restraint builds more authority. Meanwhile, the amateur is stuck in the opposite cycle. Over-explaining undermines authority. Lack of authority creates need to explain more. More explanation further undermines authority. It's a death spiral, and the only way out is to stop defending, stop over-explaining, stop trying to control how you're perceived. through verbal gymnastics. Just be clear, be brief, be done, and trust that the people who need to understand will, and the people who don't, won't, regardless of how many words you waste trying to make them. The authority of the unspoken is ultimately about trust, trusting yourself enough to let silence do some of the work, trusting that you don't need to fill every gap, trusting that your value doesn't depend on constant verbal demonstration, and when you trust that, others start trusting it too. They stop questioning your decisions because you stopped sounding uncertain about them. They stop doubting your competence because you stopped trying so hard to prove it. They start seeing you as authoritative simply because you carry yourself like someone who doesn't need approval. And you created all of that not by talking more, but by talking less. So let's bring this full circle, because everything we've covered, strategic observation, economy of words, power retention, magnetic restraint, emotional sovereignty, authority of the unspoken, these aren't separate skills you bolt onto your personality. They're facets of the same fundamental shift, from reactive verbal expression to intentional communication, from speaking to fill space to speaking to create impact, from words as waste to words as weapons. In the best sense, precise, powerful, deployed only when they serve your purpose. Here's what happens when you integrate these laws into how you move through the world. You stop being exhausted by conversation because you're not performing anymore, not trying to manage everyone's perception. You're just present, observing, contributing when it adds value that saves enormous amounts of energy. Energy you can redirect to building, thinking, creating. You start being taken more seriously, not because you've changed what you say, but because you've changed how often you say it. Scarcity creates value, and when your words are scarce, they become valuable. People start seeking your opinion instead of ignoring it. You start seeing people more clearly because you're not projecting your own noise onto them. You're listening, watching, noticing patterns, and that information becomes strategic advantage in every relationship, every negotiation, every situation where you need to read the room. You become harder to manipulate because manipulation works through verbal engagement. The more you talk, the more material someone has to work with, the more buttons they can push. But when you speak sparingly and hold your reactions, your smooth surface, nothing to grip, nothing to exploit, you develop presence that doesn't need announcement, the kind that walks into a room and changes the energy without saying a word, because people feel the difference between someone who needs attention and someone who commands it through self-possession. And that feeling, that subtle shift in the room, that's power, not loud power, not aggressive power, but the kind that endures, the kind that builds influence over time rather than demanding it in the moment. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be one." And being one, in part, means letting your character speak through your actions and your restraint, not through constant verbal assertion of your values. The man who talks endlessly about his principles is often compensating for not living them. The man who lives them doesn't need to talk about them. They're visible in everything he does. Here's the challenge most men face when they try to implement this. Silence feels uncomfortable. Restraint feels like you're missing out. Watching while others talk feels passive, but push through that discomfort, because on the other side of it is a different level of operation, a level where you're not competing for airtime because you've transcended that competition, a level where you're not worried about being heard because you know that when you speak, it lands, a level where conversation becomes easier because you've stopped trying so hard. You'll slip. Everyone does. You'll catch yourself over-explaining something or filling silence out of nervousness or reacting verbally when you meant to stay silent. That's fine. That's not failure. That's feedback. Notice it. Adjust. Keep building the muscle of verbal discipline, because this is a practice, not a destination. Even the most disciplined communicator has moments where they talk too much or say something they wish they hadn't. The difference is they notice faster and correct course quicker. They don't spiral into shame or justification. They just note it and move on, and over time, those slips become rarer. The restraint becomes more natural. The silence becomes more comfortable, and the impact of your words becomes more pronounced. Here's what I want you to carry forward. Your words are not infinite. Every sentence you speak is energy you're spending, presence you're sharing, power you're either building or giving away. Most of the time, you're giving it away not maliciously, just unconsciously, through explanations that weren't needed, defenses that weren't requested, stories that didn't serve the moment, but now you know better. Now you know that the space between impulse and speech is where your power lives. That strategic silence isn't weakness. It's warfare, and that the less you speak, the more every word weighs. So tomorrow, try this in your soul. Next conversation, wait. 2 seconds longer than feels comfortable before responding. Watch what happens in that space. Watch what you notice, what you feel, what the other person reveals, just that. 2 extra seconds before you speak, and then build from there, because mastery isn't built in grand gestures. It's built in small, uncomfortable moments where you choose discipline over default, and over time, those moments compound. They shape how you show up, how you're perceived, how you influence the world around you. The quiet work you do in these small spaces is building the kind of presence they'll never see coming while others are broadcasting. You're concentrating while they're performing, you're observing while they're explaining, you're executing, and when you finally speak, they'll listen, because you've made your words rare enough to be valuable, powerful enough to matter. Stay focused, stay grounded, and remember, in a world that rewards noise, silence is revolution.